What if the CEO of a massive restaurant empire stepped into one of his own stores, just an ordinary visit, one he'd done 100 times before, and uncovered something sinister festering beneath the surface, not just poor management or slow service, but a kind of rot, corruption, a manager using fear as a weapon, stealing wages, silencing voices. And what he uncovered next would unravel everything he thought he knew about his business. This wasn't just a quest for justice. It became a personal war, a fight to reclaim the soul of the company he built. And it all began with one unexpected visit, one overheard conversation, and a choice that would alter lives forever. The sun bore down over Houston, casting golden streaks through the bustling streets, where the rhythm of the city pulsed with life. Office workers on break, families out for lunch, and crews from nearby sites all moved with hungry purpose. At the heart of this flow stood Hale's Burgers, red and gold signage bold against the sky. One of many in the nationwide chain, but today, this location was about to become the epicenter of something far greater than burgers and fries. Richard Hale stepped out of his sleek SUV, adjusting his sunglasses against the glare. He looked up at the sign, familiar yet distant. This wasn't a business trip. Today, he wasn't the CEO, he was just a man, a father, a customer. Beside him, his 10-year-old son Ethan tugged at his shirt, full of the boundless energy only a child could have. "Can I get extra fries this time?" he asked. Richard smiled, tousling the boy's hair. "Let's see if they're worth it first." These were the moments Richard cherished, away from boardrooms and earnings calls, immersed in the real world. To him, seeing his business through a customer's eyes was more revealing than any report. But as they stepped through the glass door, that feeling of pride was immediately replaced with something colder, an unease that slithered through his gut. The smells were right. Grilled meat, crisping fries, that hint of lemon cleaner. The noise was what you'd expect, the steady beep of registers, the hum of kitchen machinery, conversations in motion. But something intangible clung to the air. An absence. No laughter, no lightness, no banter among co-workers. His eyes scanned the room. Employees moved with mechanical precision, eyes down, shoulders taut. A young fry cook cast quick glances toward the back. A server visibly flinched at a command yelled from the kitchen, and at the register stood a young woman with a name tag that read Lisa. She wore professionalism like armor. Her voice was polite but forced. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Richard and Ethan stepped in line, watching as Lisa took an order from an elderly woman. The moment the woman turned away, Lisa's shoulders sagged. Her breath escaped in a way that betrayed the emotional cost of her job. When it was their turn, she lifted her face again, bright, practiced. "Welcome to Hale's Burgers. What can I get for you today?" Richard ordered casually, trying to keep the tone light. "Fries been good today?" She gave a tight nod. "Yes, sir." Not much of an answer. He took the receipt from her steady hands, but noticed her fingers hovered just a second too long above the buttons, like she was afraid to press the wrong one. As Ethan bounded off to a booth, Richard excused himself. "Be right back," he said, already angling toward the restrooms. But his focus wasn't on the facilities. He was listening, watching. Something didn't sit right. He moved with calm intention, catching pieces of whispers from behind the staff area. And then he heard it. "Do you think you matter here? I could replace you by tomorrow." The voice was sharp, confident in its cruelty. Richard stopped mid-stride, heart thudding. That voice had a tone he recognized. Unchecked power. The kind of authority that thrived in shadows. He edged closer, barely breathing, the cold tile wall pressing against his back as he listened. "I don't care how long you've worked here," the voice sneered. "Step up or step out." Silence followed, the kind that blankets a room when fear takes over. He recognized the pattern. He'd fired people like this before, bullies who climbed the ranks by stepping on the backs of others. Inside, another voice emerged, soft, controlled, trying not to tremble. "I'm doing my best," Lisa said. Her response was met with a mocking scoff. "Your best isn't enough. Keep screwing up and I'll start cutting your shifts. Maybe then you'll learn." Richard didn't need to see it to imagine the scene. Lisa standing stiff, eyes lowered, probably gripping the edge of her apron to stay grounded. Mark, he caught the name, was the kind of manager who believed fear was more effective than leadership. "You understand, huh?" Mark pressed, closer now. "Then why does this keep happening?" No answer came, only silence. The kind that tells you no matter what you say, it won't matter. Richard clenched his fist. He had been Lisa once, young, ambitious, under the thumb of someone who thought power meant domination. He knew what it felt like to be afraid at work, and he also knew that silence let abuse grow. He turned and walked back to his table. Ethan was already devouring fries, oblivious to the emotional storm behind his father's calm expression. Richard sat down slowly, his gaze returning to the counter. Lisa had returned, her hands shaking as she rang up another customer. Mark stood nearby, arms crossed, posture rigid, surveilling the floor like a warden. The staff froze whenever he moved. Then something shifted. Lisa reached for a receipt and knocked over a stack of trays. She immediately dropped to pick them up, whispering a quick apology. Mark didn't shout, but the glare he gave her sent a chill through the air. That look said everything. Richard leaned back, breathing deeply. This wasn't an isolated event. It was a culture of fear. Then he saw it. Mark, moving behind the register. He opened the cash drawer. Richard's eyes followed closely. Instead of just counting, Mark slipped a few bills into his hand. Quick, practiced, and casually walked toward the back office. It was subtle, but not subtle enough. Richard's grip on his drink tightened, his jaw clenched. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was theft, abuse, corruption. And it had just made this visit into something much bigger than lunch. This was the moment everything changed. Richard traced the rim of his drink without thinking, his mind 1,000 miles from the lunch in front of him. The buzz of conversations, the clatter of trays, the hum of fryers, it all faded into the background. What echoed in his thoughts was what he had just seen, Mark Dawson, slipping cash from the register into his hand, like it was no big deal. Like it was habit. His instincts screamed for action. Confront the man, call him out right then and there. But Richard knew better. He'd run companies long enough to understand that the worst mistakes were made in anger and haste. If Mark was stealing, it wasn't his first time, and people like that didn't operate alone or carelessly. They had systems, shadows, protection. No. Richard needed to know how deep the roots of this rot went. He exhaled, slow and measured. Any sudden move might spook Mark into hiding the evidence or worse, silencing anyone who could speak against him. Across the room, Lisa had returned to the register. She moved with precision but not peace. Richard noticed the slight hitch in her breath, the way her eyes flickered toward the kitchen like a deer constantly scanning for predators. Then something caught his attention near the back. Among the line of younger, jittery staff moved an older man, efficient, calm, and quietly competent. Unlike the rest, he didn't seem afraid. That alone made Richard curious. "I'll be right back," he told Ethan, whose only response was to dip another fry into ketchup. Richard approached the counter and waited until the older employee turned. "Food's looking good back there," he said lightly. The man didn't smile but gave a quick nod. "Thanks, we try." His name tag read Alex Carter. There was a calm strength about Alex, like someone who'd seen the storm more than once and simply learned how to survive it. He wasn't rebellious, but he wasn't broken either. "You been here long?" Richard asked, keeping it casual. Alex shrugged, wiping his hands. "Long enough." Richard nodded. "Seems like a busy place." Alex gave a dry chuckle, but the weariness behind it was unmistakable. "Busy, yeah, but it's not the rush that wears people down." That made Richard lean in just a little. "What do you mean?" Alex hesitated, glancing behind him. Mark was gone, likely in his office again. The moment felt safe, brief, but enough. "I like the job," Alex said finally. "I like the people, but management?" He shook his head. "We're not here to build anything. We're here to follow orders and make someone else look good. Keep your head down. Don't ask questions." Richard kept his face neutral. "Sounds rough." Alex wiped down the counter slowly. "It's more than rough. It's toxic. People don't leave because of the work. They leave because they can't take him anymore." "Mark," Richard said quietly. Alex nodded, locking eyes with Richard for just a beat. "He gets rid of anyone who steps out of line, and if you talk, well, you don't last long." That was all Richard needed to confirm what he already suspected. Mark wasn't just a thief. He was a tyrant, one protected by silence and fear. Richard thanked Alex and returned to his seat, his appetite gone. He peeled back the wrapper on his burger, but the food felt irrelevant now. His mind raced, tracing the pattern of what he'd seen and heard. For nearly an hour he sat and watched. Mark emerged from his office more than once, pacing the restaurant floor like a king surveying his kingdom. He didn't help. He didn't instruct. He just loomed. And every time he did, the staff recoiled, like shadows shrinking from light. Richard watched as a teenage employee hesitated while refilling the soda machine. "Are you serious?" Mark's voice cut through the air like a blade. "It's not rocket science." The boy fumbled, hands trembling as he tried to fix the machine. No one rushed to help. No one dared. From the register, Lisa glanced up, just for a moment, her eyes finding Richard's. Then she quickly looked away. That flash of connection said everything. This wasn't just about Mark being a bully. It was about the entire environment he'd created, one where fear replaced respect, where compliance was survival. And somewhere in all of that, Mark was siphoning money like it was his right. Richard's mind moved faster now, connecting the dots. If Mark was skimming so openly, someone either wasn't paying attention or they were deliberately ignoring it. It meant corruption, not just mismanagement. He looked at Ethan, now stirring the bottom of his milkshake absent-mindedly. It grounded Richard in something deeper, responsibility. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a father, a leader, someone who owed these employees a safe place to work. Then it happened again. A young employee brought Mark a printout, likely a receipt audit. Mark barely glanced at it before popping open the register, removing a few bills and slipping them into his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. No record, no receipt, no reason. He disappeared into his office without a single glance back. Richard stared at the register. Less than 5 minutes had passed since the last customer. The till had been full, and now it wasn't. The theft wasn't just possible, it was undeniable. He let out a breath, steady and cold. This wasn't amateur. It was systematic, the kind of quiet theft that builds over time, just enough to evade the systems, just enough to stay under the radar. He looked back at Lisa. She'd been there earlier when Mark took money. She had to know. She had to have seen this before. But the question wasn't if she knew, it was if she'd talk. She moved with caution, always calculating the space around her, the kind of woman who had learned survival in silence. But the fact that she was still here meant something: strength, endurance, or maybe hope. A few minutes later, she stepped from behind the counter with a tray of supplies. Richard seized the moment. He stood, taking a slow, casual route that brought him near the beverage station. As they crossed paths, he spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "Working here looks exhausting." Lisa didn't flinch. She moved with the same practiced efficiency, adjusting lids and napkins like she hadn't heard him. But then, quietly, she said, "Depends who you ask." Her voice was neutral, careful, controlled. Richard nodded, lowering his own voice. "Seems like it gets tense sometimes." Lisa didn't look at him directly, but the way she exhaled, the pause between motions, spoke louder than words. Something inside her was listening, watching, waiting to see if she could trust him. And Richard knew, in that quiet exchange, that the next move would determine everything. It's a job. There it was. Guarded. Simple. The kind of answer someone gives when they've learned that honesty often comes with consequences. Richard leaned gently against the counter, offering the most human thing he could. Understanding. "Yeah," he said, voice calm. "I've had jobs like that before." Lisa looked at him then. Really looked. Just for a moment, something flickered behind her tired eyes. Curiosity. Doubt. A small crack in the mask. "Have you?" Richard nodded. "Started in restaurants when I was a kid. Had bosses like him." He didn't say Mark's name. He didn't have to. They both knew who he meant. Lisa exhaled, and a quiet, almost imperceptible chuckle escaped. Dry, restrained, but not entirely bitter. "Then you already know how it works." Richard tilted his head slightly. "How what works?" She hesitated, eyes drifting for a second toward the kitchen, then back to her hands. A shrug followed, small and weary. "Some people do whatever they want. The rest of us, we just try to keep up." It wasn't a confession, but it was confirmation. She knew, and more importantly, she'd learned how to survive it. The second, Richard didn't push further. Not yet. He could see it. She wasn't ready. A survivor like Lisa didn't trust easily. She had spent too long measuring every word, every look, calculating safety. "Sounds frustrating," he said softly. Lisa nodded once. "Could be worse." But her hand gripped the counter a little tighter, and that told him more than words ever could. There was more pain, more truth, but it was locked up tight behind years of caution. As Richard walked back to his table, a plan had already begun to form. He had the vision. Now he needed leverage, and more than anything, he needed Lisa to believe he wasn't just another passerby. He was someone who could listen and maybe change things. And she looked like someone who had been waiting a long time for someone like that. He stayed alert, watched for patterns. Then, an opportunity. Lisa emerged from behind the counter with the clipboard in hand, heading toward the back, toward the storage room. Richard stood up, his movements casual, natural, slipping into her path without drawing attention. By the time he reached the door, Lisa was finishing her inventory check. She turned, surprised to see him standing nearby. "Did you need something?" she asked, guarded again. "Just stretching my legs," Richard replied, voice warm. "Place gets busy, huh?" She nodded, shifting her stance. One hand clutched the clipboard like a shield. "Work must be tough," he added gently. Her pause was brief. "It's a job, but not all jobs come with a boss like Mark." Her eyes met his, just briefly. Her grip tightened. "He's particular," she said. Measured. Richard didn't respond immediately. He let the moment stretch. Then, with careful quiet, "I've been watching him. He's not just strict, He's controlling. Lisa's lips twitched. Not a smile, something closer to resignation. A breath escaped her nose, almost a laugh, but steeped in tension. You don't know the half of it. Then tell me, Richard said, his voice low. What am I missing? She scanned the hallway. No one nearby. And then she said, soft, hesitant, but real. He cuts hours. If he doesn't like you, your schedule disappears, little by little, until you either quit or he fires you. Richard's jaw tensed. He controls the scheduling? Lisa nodded. And payroll. The clock ins, clock outs, they're tracked, but somehow our checks always come up short. If you ask about it, he says it's a system glitch. But it's not, Richard said. No, Lisa replied, it only happens to people who aren't close to him. This was more than theft. This was systematic, strategic exploitation. How long has it been going on? Lisa shrugged. Longer than I've been here. That was all Richard needed. It wasn't just Mark. It couldn't be. Someone had to know. Lisa lowered her voice further. It's not just him. Richard froze. She looked around, then locked eyes with him. Some people tried reporting him, sent complaints, a couple even had proof. They don't work here anymore. Soon they were fired. Lisa nodded grimly. Or pushed out. He'd cut their shifts, write them up for nothing, make life so hard they had to leave. In corporate, Lisa laughed quietly, bitterly. Nothing changed. He's still here, isn't he? Richard's stomach sank. This wasn't just about a rogue manager. This was deeper, protected, institutional. Lisa glanced toward the front. I shouldn't be talking about this. Richard stepped back, giving her space. He didn't press, but before she could leave, he said one more thing. If it ever gets worse, or if you decide it's time to fight back, I'll listen. She didn't reply, but she didn't look away. She walked off slowly, leaving Richard standing there, knowing he had just crossed the threshold into something much bigger. Later, parked a few blocks away, Richard pulled up the internal dashboard of Hale's Burgers on his phone. Years of executive access gave him a back door into the company's systems, something most employees didn't even know existed. He wasn't going to wait. He needed hard numbers, now. He dove into the back end, sales reports, expense logs, performance summaries. It didn't take long. The numbers screamed. This location was underperforming, badly, down 15 to 20% in revenue despite normal foot traffic. But then came the glaring red flags. Inventory reports showed regular usage, meat, buns, condiments at normal depletion levels. But the revenue didn't match. It wasn't being sold. It was vanishing. Then he saw the operational deductions, line items with vague titles like adjustments or miscellaneous maintenance, repeated, unjustified, inflated. An old trick, create phony expenses to launder the stolen money. Mark was stealing, that much was now certain. But Richard's gut whispered something worse. He thought of Lisa's words, the ones that chilled him most. It's not just Mark. And deep down, he knew this wasn't just about corruption at the store level. This was the beginning of something much darker. And Richard Hale wasn't going to look away. He was going to burn it to the ground. People had tried to report Mark before. Nothing changed. That told Richard everything he needed to know. Someone up the corporate chain was making sure those complaints were buried before they ever reached a decision maker. This wasn't just neglect. It was protection, which meant Mark Dawson wasn't acting alone. Someone was keeping his operation afloat, and Richard intended to find out who. He leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly, the weight of that realization settling in his chest like concrete. If Mark had been skimming money this blatantly, this confidently, for this long, then either someone above him was blind or they were complicit. Richard didn't believe in coincidence, especially not in business. His fingers hovered over his phone, searching his contacts until he stopped on a familiar name. David Langley. David, the company's chief financial officer, was one of the few people Richard still trusted inside Hale's Burgers. Smart, deliberate, and more importantly, honest. If there was rot in the company's financial foundation, David would either know where it started or know how to trace it. Richard tapped call. David answered on the third ring. "Richard? Haven't heard from you in a while." Richard kept his tone steady, casual. "Looking into something. Need your eyes on a few numbers." David paused. "All right, go on." "I'm at one of the Houston stores," Richard began. "Something's off. Revenue's low, but inventory use is normal. Expenses are padded with vague labels, and..." He glanced toward the restaurant. "I watched the manager take cash from the register. Didn't log it." Silence on the other end. Then David exhaled. "That's not a mistake. That's organized theft." "Exactly," Richard said, tapping the steering wheel absently. "I need to know who's been signing off on these adjustments." "I'll dig," David replied, voice low. "But if this has been happening a while, it might be buried deep." "Start with payroll for this region," Richard suggested. "Employees are saying their hours are being cut and checks are coming up short." David gave a thoughtful hum. "All right, give me some time." Richard nodded. "Appreciate it." As the call ended, Richard's mind pivoted back to Mark. This wasn't a man who operated out of desperation. This was a man who operated with confidence, because he believed he was protected. But what Mark didn't realize was who was now watching. Whispered, hurrah. It's simply, it's Lorrigan's again. Richard wasn't just here to catch him. He was here to end it. Later that evening, Richard sat in his car parked a few blocks away, the restaurant now quieter, the lunch crowd gone and the dinner rush dying down. The soft glow from his phone screen lit up his face as he dove deeper into the data. The numbers weren't just suspicious, they were damning. This wasn't carelessness, it was structured, systematic. Mark wasn't working alone, and someone above him knew exactly what was happening. Richard tapped David's name again, and when the CFO picked up, his voice was tight. "Richard, I was expecting your call." Richard didn't waste time. "I need everything you've got on the payroll and financial sign-offs for the Houston locations, especially anything tied to Mark Dawson." David hesitated, then spoke carefully. "What location are you at, exactly?" Richard didn't answer. "Not yet. Tell me what you know about our Houston stores." There was a pause on the line. Paper rustled. "Nothing specific," David said slowly. "But if you're seeing numbers like that, then someone with corporate access is pulling strings. That doesn't come from the store level." "Exactly my concern," Richard said. "I want you to check Mark's employment file. Every transfer, every raise." David's tone dropped. "All right, but if he's been protected, we're not just looking at theft. We're looking at a network." "Then it's time to tear it down," Richard replied. 30 minutes later, his phone buzzed. A message from David. "Check Mark's history. You're not going to like what you find." Richard opened the attached file. The first few lines were ordinary. Hired 7 years ago, promoted to GM 3 years later. But then came the pattern. Mark had been transferred from Dallas. Before that, San Antonio. Both locations had filed reports of financial discrepancies during Mark's tenure. Both previous managers had been quietly dismissed. And Mark promoted. Richard's stomach turned. This wasn't an oversight. This was orchestration. A playbook that repeated itself. Mark arrived, irregularities followed, whistleblowers disappeared. Mark moved up. Back at the store, Mark paced his office. He could feel the shift. The energy in the restaurant was wrong. The fear he relied on, his tool of control, wasn't gone, but it was fractured. His employees were more guarded, their fear more reactive. Especially Lisa. She was moving differently, watching more, whispering more. And then there was the man from earlier, clean, quiet, observant, not like a customer, more like a threat. Mark's instincts, honed through years of manipulation, told him something was unraveling. He scrolled through the week's employee schedules. Lisa had been working nearly every day, so had Alex, the kitchen hand who always seemed too calm, too immune to Mark's pressure. He frowned. Then there was the stranger, the one who had been asking questions. Mark's stomach nodded. He needed to know who that man was. And if Lisa was involved, he'd remind her of what happened to employees who forgot their place. Out on the floor, Richard had just finished a quiet exchange with Lisa when he noticed the shadow approaching. But he approached with that faux casual walk, that smooth smile. "I see you've made a new friend, Lisa," he said, his voice sugary but sharp. Lisa stiffened beside Richard, her hands clenched slightly around her apron. "Just chatting," she said softly. Mark laughed. Light, but laced with poison. "That's good. Wouldn't want you getting distracted." His gaze bore into her. Then he leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper. "You know what happens when people start getting ideas, don't you?" Lisa's face paled. Richard's jaw locked. Mark lingered one beat longer. Then he straightened, smile never fading. "Enjoy your meal," he said with a nod to Richard. Lisa stood frozen, her eyes staring at a fixed point on the wall, her hands clenched so tightly that the blood drained from her knuckles. Richard didn't speak. He knew timing mattered now more than ever. Pushing too hard would only make things worse. But he also knew one thing for certain. Mark knew he was being watched. And if Richard didn't act soon, Lisa would be the one to pay the price. That night, in a dim hotel room, the soft hum of the air conditioner was the only sound as Richard sat hunched over his laptop. The numbers on the screen confirmed what he'd feared. This wasn't just one corrupt man. This was a system designed to let him thrive. Richard picked up his phone and called David. David answered immediately. "I had a feeling I'd be hearing from you." Richard stared at the ceiling for a long moment before replying. "It's time. We're going after them, all of them. I need you to pull the last 6 months of transaction records from the Houston location," Richard said flatly into the phone. "I want everything. Cash reports, payroll entries, expense logs, anything with a number." On the other end, David Langley let out a slow exhale. "You think you've found something?" "I know I did," Richard said, his voice calm but burning with resolve. "I just need the proof to match the pattern." There was no argument. David had heard enough in Richard's tone to know this wasn't a hunch. It was a battle cry. "Give me a few hours," he said. Richard ended the call and leaned back, the hotel room dim and still. Outside, the Houston streets buzzed in the summer heat. Inside, Richard's mind was racing through memories, patterns, clues. He had a strong feeling Mark wasn't stealing on impulse. He was doing it with intention, on a schedule. And schedules always left footprints, even in a system built on deception. A few hours later, his inbox lit up. He opened the files David had sent and scanned through them, his stomach turning with every line. It was worse than he'd imagined. The discrepancies weren't scattered or subtle. They were deliberate, methodical. On every day Mark was working, the reported revenue dropped while inventory usage remained consistent. That wasn't sloppiness. It was precision theft. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Richard found fake expense entries. Tiny, innocuous charges labeled as equipment maintenance or employee meal adjustments. Small enough to fly under the radar, but when plotted across months, thousands gone. Then came the payroll records. Multiple employees had their hours slashed, not in person, not in real time, but after the fact. On paper, they'd worked less, but in reality, they'd given their full shift. Someone was modifying time logs. That meant Mark, or someone working with him, was shaving hours after clockouts, quietly stealing wages. Richard's hands tightened around the edge of his laptop. This wasn't just greed, it was cruelty. He clicked open the employment records David had included. These weren't just numbers now. These were stories. People. Lives affected by theft disguised as oversight. And that's when he saw it. Other stores, Dallas, San Antonio, Baton Rouge, all with identical financial fingerprints. Missing revenue, fake expenses, mysteriously reduced hours. And every single one had one name in common: Mark Dawson. But there was another name, one that appeared just as frequently, just as quietly. Ronald Vickers, Regional Director of Operations. Richard leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. Ronald had been the one signing off on Mark's promotions. Ronald had been the one who circulated internal memos about labor cost optimization. Ronald had been the one who vouched for Mark every time a store underperformed. And Ronald had a history. Before Hale's Burgers, he'd worked at another major chain. There had been whispers there, too. Financial mismanagement, unexplained terminations, sudden resignations. But nothing had stuck. Nothing had ever reached the surface. Until now. This wasn't just a rogue employee running a side hustle. This was a network. Mark was the muscle, Ronald was the brain. And Richard, he had just become their reckoning. He shut the laptop slowly, jaw tight. He had spent years building Hale's Burgers into something meaningful, something real. And now it was being gutted from the inside by men who saw integrity as a liability. If he wanted to stop this, he couldn't just expose Mark. He had to take down Ronald. Richard didn't wait another day. He walked back into the Houston store during peak rush, but he didn't feel the heat of the grill or hear the clatter of trays. All he felt was purpose. This ended now. He strode straight past the counter. Mark spotted him instantly, and the confidence drained from his face like ink in water. Richard clapped his hands once, sharp, loud. "Everyone, gather around," he announced, his voice slicing through the chatter like a bell. Employees froze. The ones behind the counter looked confused. Lisa and Alex exchanged a glance. Mark's face paled. "I didn't know we were having a company meeting today," Mark said, trying for humor. It came out brittle. "We are," Richard said coldly, "and it concerns you." Silence. Richard faced the staff. "For months you've worked under a system designed to exploit you. Hours cut without reason, wages stolen, profits disappearing, all while you worked your hardest." There were murmurs, uneasy glances. Lisa's lips parted, but she didn't speak. Richard pulled out the printed financials and held them up. "These are the financial records for this store over the last 6 months. Thousands of dollars have vanished, and every trail leads to one man." He turned to Mark. "Care to explain why revenue always drops when you're on shift, but inventory doesn't?" Mark's face twitched. "This is ridiculous." or why payroll logs were edited after employees clocked out, Richard cut in. Wages cut, hours erased. Someone gasped. A whisper rippled through the crowd. Mark scoffed, his bravado crumbling. You don't know what it takes to run a store. Running a store means taking care of your people, Richard said, stepping closer. Not robbing them. Mark's hands curled into fists. You think they care? He pointed at the employees. These people never speak up. They never fight back. Lisa stepped forward. We do now. Alex followed. Yeah. We're done being quiet. Others followed suit. Heads nodded. Postures straightened. Fear had left the room. Mark looked around, the weight of reality crashing down. He had no power left, no one to protect him. You're finished here, Richard said. Mark tried to argue, but his voice cracked. Then, with one last glare, he turned and stormed out. The door slammed behind him. Silence hung in the air for a moment, and then it broke. Sigh from the back. A laugh. Then applause. Not for Richard, but for each other. Lisa's shoulders dropped. She looked at Richard, not as a stranger, but as someone who had finally seen them. Richard nodded to them all. A temporary manager will be brought in. No one will be punished for speaking up. If you have concerns, I'm here, and I'll listen. The nods weren't out of fear. They were out of hope. But Richard knew this wasn't over. Back at corporate headquarters, the tone was different, colder. He stepped into the building and felt the unease instantly. Eyes flicked toward him, then away. Conversations died mid-sentence. Then he saw why. Ronald Vickers, waiting in a glass conference room, legs crossed, hands folded. Calm. Calculated. A man who wasn't afraid of confrontation, because he believed he controlled the outcome. Richard entered, shut the door behind him. You enjoy sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, don't you? Ronald said, his voice smooth as silk over a blade. When my employees are being exploited, it becomes my business. You think getting rid of Mark changes anything? Ronald asked, his smile dry. You think you just slayed the dragon? I think I exposed the one pulling the strings. Ronald leaned back. You still don't get it. Mark wasn't the machine. He was just a cog. Richard's jaw clenched. Then, it's time I dismantled the whole damn machine. Replaceable. That single word echoed through the silence like a cold blade. Ronald leaned back in his chair, entirely composed, smiling even. Richard, seated across from him, felt a heavy knot settle in his chest. There was no panic in Ronald's voice, no scrambling for excuses, just calm certainty. Removing Mark hadn't shaken him. It had merely inconvenienced him. And that could only mean one thing. Ronald had already prepared his next move. By the next morning, the ambush had begun. Hale's Burgers was everywhere. Every headline painted a different version of the same twisted narrative. Disorder in the ranks. Internal crisis erupts at Hale's Burgers. Ex-manager claims unfair dismissal amid executive power grab. Corporate retaliation, whistleblowers silenced at Hale's. It wasn't about Mark's theft anymore. It wasn't about the stolen wages, the intimidation, or the years of employee abuse. Ronald had flipped the narrative. Richard wasn't the reformer. He was the villain. He sat in his office, scrolling through article after article, the absurdity compounding with every headline. Stories framed him as a ruthless executive purging loyal managers. Whispers about revenge, ambition, and a desperate bid for control flooded the press. Social media was even worse. Threads painting him as a corporate tyrant, hashtags skewering his name. The fire was spreading. His phone buzzed. David, I assume you've seen the news. Richard didn't look away from the screen. I've seen it. This is coordinated. David said. Someone fed this story to the media and made sure it went viral. I know who did it. Ronald hadn't sent a legal team. He hadn't threatened Richard with lawsuits or silence. He'd gone after something far more dangerous. Public perception. And it was working. Richard shut his laptop and stared out the window, jaw clenched. He had made his move. Now he had to survive Ronald's counterattack. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Later that night, Richard met Lisa and Alex at a small cafe on the edge of town. The air was quiet, the tension thick with unspoken urgency. They were no longer just staff. They were allies. We've started reaching out to former employees, Lisa said, her voice sharp with purpose. I spoke to Daniel Carter, she added. He was assistant manager before Mark took over, said he found financial discrepancies. The moment he brought it up, they fired him for performance issues. Richard nodded. Keep going. Alex, quieter but no less invested, leaned in. There's a guy named Jordan. Worked at a sister store. Hours slashed, but payroll still showed full-time. Never saw the difference in his paycheck. Richard made a note. Wage theft, systemic. Lisa hesitated. There's one more. Cassandra. She worked in corporate accounting. She flagged irregularities multiple times. Every time she did, she was told she miscalculated. Eventually, they froze her out. How's it? The missing link. Can we talk to her? She's scared, Lisa admitted. Says she doesn't want to get involved. She doesn't have to go public, Richard said. I just need confirmation, something we can trace. Lisa nodded. Now they had the people. All they needed was a platform. The next day, Richard reached out to an investigative journalist he trusted, someone who made a career exposing stories like this. Quiet corruption hiding in plain sight. He handed over everything, manipulated timesheets, fake expense reports, testimonies. This isn't just one bad manager, Richard told him. This is a system, and I believe it goes even higher than Ronald. The journalist leaned in. If what you're saying is true, this is going to explode. That's the idea, Richard said. But just as momentum began to build, David called again, this time with something bigger. Something that would change everything. He'd found it. A large financial transfer from Ronald's personal account, not to an offshore shell, but to another executive, a senior board member. Richard opened the report. His blood chilled as he read the name. James Prescott, board member, trusted advisor, one of the longest-standing figures at Halesburgers, and he had been taking money. It all made sense. The buried reports, the protected positions, the endless cycle of corruption. This wasn't about Ronald anymore. This went all the way to the top. Richard entered the boardroom at headquarters, sunlight streaming through glass walls, casting sharp lines on a long oak table. Around it sat the most powerful people in the company, faces that once looked like colleagues, friends. Now they looked like suspects. I called this meeting, Richard began, his voice calm, controlled, because this company has been compromised. A murmur rippled through the room. Financial manipulation, employee exploitation, widespread theft, and it's been happening under our noses for years. He laid down the folder. Here's your proof. He showed them the falsified expenses, the altered payroll, the wage manipulation. Alan Whitaker frowned. These are serious allegations. They're facts, Richard said. And here's something worse. He flipped another page. Funds from Ronald's personal account, transferred to James Prescott. The room fell into stunned silence. James chuckled. That's quite the accusation. Richard stared him down. I'm not guessing, James. I have the transaction logs, the meetings, the timeline. He slid the proof across the table. You didn't just protect Ronald, you profited from him. James's jaw tightened, but before he could reply, another voice rang out. I've heard enough." Everyone turned. Sarah Anderson, co-founder, legacy voice on the board, trusted by all. She stood, gaze like ice. This company was built on trust, on fairness. If even half of what Richard says is true, we've betrayed that. She turned to the board. "I propose a formal internal investigation, effective immediately, and until it's completed, both Ronald and James are suspended." A wave of agreement moved through the room. James stood, furious. "You can't be serious." "You lost our trust," Sarah said, unmoved, "and this company's integrity isn't yours to gamble with." James's face flushed with anger. "This isn't over." Richard looked him dead in the eye. "No, it's not, because I'm not done yet." James grabbed his briefcase and stormed out. And for the first time in months, silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt like clarity. It felt like justice finally beginning to take root. Sarah turned to Richard, her tone solemn but resolute. "You've exposed a rot that runs deep. We have a lot of work ahead." Richard gave a small nod, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. "Then let's get started." The conference room was a sea of media presence. Reporters filled every chair, their eyes sharp with expectation. Cameras captured every angle. The air buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't a typical corporate press briefing. This was a reckoning. Richard stood quietly near the entrance, observing as Lisa, Alex, and other whistleblowers readied themselves. No longer victims, they were stepping forward as agents of truth. He straightened his tie and glanced at Lisa. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded, exhaling slowly. "I have to be." He smiled. She wasn't the timid cashier from months ago. She had found her voice, and today she would use it. Richard took the podium, his expression steady. He didn't need a speech. This story was etched into his very soul. "For too long," he began, "this company turned a blind eye. Exploitation festered while leadership remained silent. That ends today." He stepped back, motioning to Lisa. Lisa stepped up. She gripped the microphone with trembling fingers, but her voice was clear. "My name is Lisa. I worked under Mark Dawson. I was manipulated, silenced, and humiliated. I was told I didn't matter. But I do, and so do the people standing behind me." The room held its breath as she continued. "No one should have to choose between their job and their dignity." Alex followed, detailing the systemic wage theft and how fear silenced everyone. Then came Daniel, the ex-existent manager who had tried to report fraud but was punished. Finally, Cassandra, the corporate accountant who uncovered discrepancies but was ignored. Each story added another layer of horror. Together, they painted a damning portrait of a company lost to greed. By the time the press conference ended, the shift in public perception was palpable. Reporters scrambled to rewrite headlines. Social media ignited. Ronald's narrative collapsed in real time. Within hours, news outlets exploded with coverage. Halesburger's whistleblowers break silence. Faded, a culture of fear and fraud exposed. Public sentiment reversed. Customers pledged support. Investors who once considered backing out returned with cautious optimism. Then came the board's final judgment. Ronald Vickers and James Prescott were terminated without hesitation. Richard, seated at the head of the boardroom table, watched relief wash over some members. Others remained rattled by how deep the corruption had burrowed. He stood. "This isn't just about removing bad actors. This is about building something new, something better." He outlined a plan: anonymous feedback systems, a whistleblower protection policy, and ethical leadership training. The room listened, nodding, finally aligned with a vision of integrity. Sarah Anderson spoke next. "This is what leadership should look like." Later that day, Lisa and Alex waited outside the boardroom. "You did it," Lisa said. Richard shook his head gently. We did. The storm had passed. But the rebuilding had just begun. An internal audit uncovered more corruption, regional managers manipulating data, pocketing profits, bullying staff into silence. More firings followed. The company was finally cleaning house. In a quiet office, Richard met with Lisa and Alex. So what happens now? Alex asked. We move forward. Together, Richard replied. Lisa, your bravery deserves more than recognition. I want you to be assistant manager. Lisa's eyes widened. I don't know what to say. Alex nudged her. Try yes. She laughed and nodded. Yes, absolutely. Richard turned to Alex. You have vision and grit. I want you overseeing operations across multiple stores. Alex blinked, surprised. That's a lot. Richard smiled. I trust you. Alex smirked. Then, yeah, I'm in. The second press conference was about hope, not crisis. Richard took the podium again. This company failed to protect its own. That ends now. He introduced Lisa and Alex. They stood beside him, living proof that change wasn't theoretical. It was happening. Public trust surged. Employee surveys showed a dramatic rise in satisfaction and morale. Revenue climbed. Hale's Burgers wasn't just recovering, it was reborn. 3 months later, Richard returned to the Houston store, the place where it had all started. Ethan, his son, tagged along. We're just getting lunch this time, right? Richard chuckled. Just lunch. But remember, if you ever see injustice, speak up. Inside, the mood had transformed. The dread that once lingered was gone. Laughter, camaraderie, and pride filled the space. Lisa greeted them with a bright smile. Nice to see you finally eating for fun. Richard grinned. Figured I should try the food now that I trust the management. She leaned in. Some of these new hires applied because of what you did. Emotion tightened in Richard's chest. This was the point. As he and Ethan sat near the window, Richard glanced outside. The logo shone brightly under the sun. This wasn't just a burger joint. It was a symbol of redemption, and it had been rebuilt on truth. Leadership isn't about control. It's about protecting people. This wasn't just a story about rooting out corruption. It was about what comes after. So, if you saw injustice, would you stand by? Or would you speak up? Because stories like this, they happen every day. If this one moved you, subscribe, like, and hit the bell. More stories of power, courage, and redemption are on the way. And we're just getting started.